Hello. As promised, here's some extra footage from the Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. In a moment, the historians will be talking about whaling during the time of the Charles W. Morgan. I hope you get some good information from it.
Sit on the rock wall, you're most welcome to. So this whole thing would have started way up aloft. As you saw, Tim here was representing one of the sailors climbing high into the rig. And then, once the whale was sighted, the boat header, in this case represented by Hannah back aft, first she asked a series of questions. Where away, which means what direction, what kind, how many, how far off. And the reason they wanted to know what kind was they primarily hunted three types of whales: the right whales, the bowhead whales, and the sperm whales. So if it was one of those three kinds, then the boat header would decide how many boats to lower. In this case, you heard lower the waist boat. And then there was a lot of confusion, as you might have noticed. The boat had to be lowered. The men had to scramble down the falls and swing into the boat. The oars had to be gotten in place. The harpoons had to be rigged. All this is happening as they're heading out after the whale. And I can tell you that it's actually much easier to do this in the Mystic River than it would have been to do this out in the open ocean. So it would have been even more exciting up there. But so they're rowing away after the whale. And then when they get close, the boat header in the back would cry out to the boat steerer to stand up and give it to him. And what he's giving is the harpoons. Now this one here is an old-fashioned kind. It made such a big hole going in that it pulled out very easily. And so they lost a lot more whales than they caught with this kind of harpoon. So in 1848, a man named Lewis Temple, he was a blacksmith working in New Bedford, he perfected this toggle iron. And the toggle iron would make a small hole going in, and then it would toggle open. It wouldn't be able to pull out as easily. So they began to catch a lot more whales once this type of iron was perfected. Now you can see the harpoons or irons are attached to a line that goes to the top in the bow, underneath this kicking strap, over the tops of all the oars, around the stump in the back called the loggerhead, and into the two tubs of whale line. There's approximately 2,000 feet of line in the boat. So the whale does not like to be harpooned. It's not something that he enjoys. And so the whale might react in one of three ways. It might turn around and smash up the boat. Whales had very powerful jaws. They had very powerful tails. They could break the boat apart very easily. But luckily they didn't do that very often. It happens quite often in maritime paintings. It's written about in many books, including Herman Melville's Moby Dick. But in fact, in real life, it didn't happen nearly as often. Another thing a whale could do is dive straight down to the bottom. And sperm whales can go over 4,000 feet down. Well, we only have 2,000 feet of line in the boat. We call that the fatal discrepancy. But if the whale should dive too deep, they could attach a trough to the end of the line. And if any of you have ever had a chance to see the movie Jaws or read the book, when Peter Benchley wrote that book, he was consciously updating the story of Moby Dick. In that movie, those big orange barrels that are attached to the end of the great white shark, those are droves. Or if worse came to worse, they can grab what we call the crisis management tool here, and they can cut the line. Also, every man had a knife on him, and he could cut the line as well. But the whale didn't do that very often either. Most often, the whale simply took off across the surface of the water, going as fast as possible, averaging about 4 miles per hour, but going to burst up to 15 or 20 miles per hour. And that could last anywhere from 20 minutes to well over 24 hours. And that was what was called the Nantucket sleigh ride, if you've heard that term. And it's, interesting term. But during that Nantucket sleigh ride, other things are going on, and I'll let the rest of the folks tell you about them.
The man who rowed in this position was known as the bow oarsman because he's the man who's rowing closest to the bow or the front of the boat, who's just continuously rowing. However, he has another name. He's also known as the preventer. And preventer is just an old-fashioned way of saying to back up. So if anything should happen to the man in Mary Kate's position, the harpooner, this man would step forward and take on his role as harpooner, and he would actually get better living quarters on the whale ship than a raised pay. There's several ways to move the whale boat. You notice we were using paddles a little while ago. They're like canoe paddles. This is a very quiet, stealthy way of moving the boat. The way to sneak up on a whale. Not the quickest way to move the boat, however. Much quicker and more efficient are these lateral oars, which can get this boat moving very quickly forward and backward. You'll notice the boat is double-ended. It goes just as fast backwards as forward. The drawback with the lateral oars is that they tend to rattle in the oar locks. They make a noise, and no matter how we try to muffle it, the whales came to associate that sound with danger. And then there's finally another way to move the boat is to set a sail. So they would have a mast in the boat, they would stick the mast into this mast and drop a centerboard. Very quiet, very quick way of moving the boat. However, if you make fast to a whale and you're being towed on a Nantucket sleigh ride, you're going to have to drop that rig during that process. And you can imagine the logistics of that could be kind of challenging.
The man in this position was known as the midship oarsman because his port is right in the middle of this double-ended boat. As such, it is the lightest point in the boat, and so his is the longest and heaviest oar, being up to 18 feet long and weighing up to 45 pounds. Unlike most of the other positions in this boat, there really aren't any other responsibilities inherent to this position, so really all he's doing is rowing. So if there's a green member of the crew or somebody who's known more for their brawn than their brains, this is a good position for him, and obviously we are following tradition. So there are a couple of things near this man's position. If this boat was out for a very long time and whale hunt could last for hours, there was a water breaker near his position which held anywhere between 3 to 5 gallons of whatever passed for fresh water at a certain point in the voyage. And back aft you can see by the officer is a lantern keg which held a lantern and some means of lighting it, be it steel or lucifer matches, in case the whale hunt continued into the dark. And if the captain was a fair man, some sort of provision was usually put in there as well, some sort of salted meat, hardtack, and if he was a particularly nice man, perhaps some pipes of tobacco or some hard candy.
The man in this position we know as a tough oarsman because he's sitting between the two tubs that whale line. Now, not one position in this boat is safe, but this one has a more tangibly visible view of how dangerous this boat can be. You can see this line, when this line is paying out during a Nantucket sleigh ride, it's paying out on these tubs and hoops at a time. And if he's not careful, a hoop can grab on his oar, taking out the two men in front of him. One of them being the officer, and that'd be a really bad situation. So he has a very unique safety option on his area here. He has what's called a double oar lock, where he's able to raise his oar up about 6 inches higher, therefore giving just enough clearance so that line to pay out cleanly underneath. He has another duty available to him, and he has control or use of this one-handed bucket called a piggin. And during the Nantucket sleigh ride, you might have water coming into the boat, or you might just come up and take water from outside the boat. His job is to pour water on this line. This is a natural fiber line. And when it's creating friction around that loggerhead up front there, it can smoke, it can fray, it can break apart. It's the finest line money can buy. You want to keep it safe. You want to prevent it from breaking, losing your catch. You can also pour it on the tubs, but a commanding officer, you might also be commanded to throw it directly onto the loggerhead itself, therefore preventing the line from breaking on them.
The man in this position was known as the after oarsman, or by modern vernacular today, he would be known as the stroke oarsman. He was named thus, or is called thus today, because every man in this boat that's facing backwards can see either his shoulder or his oar as it's in the water, so he can help keep that pace of the rowing together. Now, the pace was not set by this man. It was set by the officer, who had a hand or a foot on the oar, and would possibly give some encouragement with this man's dubious sanitary habits or his possible canine ancestry. During a Nantucket sleigh ride, while all the other men are facing forward, hauling in on the line, pulling the boat closer to the whale, this man would be the only one facing backwards, coiling the line that was being pulled on this stern sheet, this flat section of deck right here. So that in case the whale were to take off again during the Nantucket sleigh ride, it would pay out cleanly and wouldn't catch on anything.
Keep your oars. By now you've heard several references to the man in my position. He was the boat header, also known as the officer. On board the mother vessel, like the Charles W. Morgan, he may have been anywhere between the first through the fifth mate, and in the earliest days of whaling, he may have even been the captain, much like Ahab is. Ahab goes down in one of these small boats in Moby Dick. However, once this small whale boat was lowered, He did become the sole voice of authority in the whaleboat, and was the captain of this smaller craft. As such, he had some skills that the other men might not possess, such as navigation, and he could make up to 10 times as much money as any of the other lunkheads in the boat. As such, it was also his duty, his privilege, and his honor to kill the whale. Now, it might seem rather difficult to kill the whale from back aft here. Sure, he could clobber it with this 22-pound steering oar, or 22-foot steering oar, but that wouldn't work especially well. So instead, at the very start of the Nantucket sleigh ride, something rather curious happens. The man who harpooned the whale, who was known most commonly as the boat steerer, would make his way back aft and come and take up this steering oar, hence the name boat steer. Then the officer would make his way forward to the working end of the boat, jumping, leaping, gracefully from thwart to thwart as the boat flies from wave top to wave top. I barely make it up here every day in the river, rolled my ankle. They would have been doing it in the open ocean. However, they would make it up here, and once the whale tired out, this man, the officer, would take up the tool that's actually going to kill the whale. Which is... and it's known as a killing lance. You can see that it does differ from the harpoon in several ways. It's not meant to stay in the whale. The end of it is teardrop shaped rather than arrowhead shaped, because at this point, and I'm sorry about this, it gets a little gross, but they were trying to stab the whale to death. So the shaft is much longer, the head is teardrop shaped so they can go in and out of the whale easily. And so this man would guide himself in the same clumsy feat that the boat steerer used to harpoon the whale. He's going to drive this iron into the back of the whale. Now, in order to kill a whale, they did want to hit a vital organ. You might think they would want to aim for the brain or the heart, but those are actually pretty difficult to access. However, what they did have easy access to was the lungs. The blowhole in the back of the whale actually essentially served as a bullseye for these whalemen. And so by aiming just behind the blowhole, they could sever the arteries that fed the lungs and essentially drown the blood in a mixture of its own blood and seawater. So when that normally clear spray that came out of the blowhole started to turn a crimson red, they knew they had struck the whale fatally, and this man would call out to his crew, "Chimneys afire," which is a poetic way of saying there's blood coming out of his blowhole, and then "Stern all for your lives." Now you may have noticed that this boat is double-ended, so it's pointing in both the bow and the stern, and that means that it can move almost as fast backwards as it can forward. So when he says "Chimneys afire," he then says "Stern all for your lives," encouraging his crew to push on their oars rather than pull, so that they can back away from this whale to give it some clearance as it dies. Whales are, after all, huge, and when they start to die, they go through what are known as their death throes or death frenzies, so they're flailing about in the water, and that can easily damage the boat. The average sperm whale is twice the size of this small boat, so they wanted to make sure they gave it some clearance. Once the whale's been fatally struck, it starts swimming in smaller and smaller concentric circles until it eventually rolls what's known as fin out, where its little pectoral fin sticks up out of the water, much like what happens when your goldfish dies so tragically. And that means that its equilibrium is offset. Now at that point they do believe the whale to be dead, but they want to make sure because there's a big difference between attaching your boat to an unconscious whale versus a dead whale. So they'll approach it one more time and poke it in a sensitive area like the lip or the eye. And once the whale is known to actually be dead, they do have several options. If there are other whales about, they might go after another one. This wasn't uncommon. We know that whales travel in families called pods, and they wanted to make the voyage as short as possible, so being able to go after multiple whales in one hunt was really, really significant. Or if another boat needed assistance, and their own boat and crew were unharmed, then they could go to the assistance of another boat. However, before they left the whale they had just caught and killed, they wanted to make sure they marked it so they could find it again. Whales do not float above the surface of the water like a big pumping hulk, but rather just below. And so in order to ensure that they could find this whale again, they would use a high-tech marking device. Can't get it out. That's good. It's a flag on a stick, known as a wave, and it would have the initials of the mother vessel, so in this case CWM for Charles W. Morgan, and then the initials of the specific whaleboat that did the catching and killing. So in this case it would say WV for waste boat. And this was considered a legal marking device. If, however, there were no other whales in the area, or no other boat needed assistance, or they were in some way damaged or harmed, they would begin that long, tedious row back to the mother vessel. Now, in order to do that, they wanted to prep the whale a little bit more, so they would take up this final tool, known as a boat spade, and you can see that it has this flat cutting edge, because the purpose of the boat spade was to make the whale a little more hydrodynamic. We know that an experienced whaleboat crew can move this boat about 5 or 6 miles per hour through the water with nothing attached. However, once you add the weight of the whales to the back of the boat and they're dragging it through the water, the crews were averaging about a mile per hour. So if during the Nantucket sleigh ride they were even dragged 5 miles away from the mother vessel, that was likely a 5-hour row they had ahead of them. So they wanted to make it as easy for themselves as possible, so they would trim off some extra areas of the whale just to make it move through the water with more ease. Then they would cut a little incision in the lip or the tail of the whale and insert a wooden toggle, which you can see back aft, which served as a tow hitch. And then they would begin that long row back to the mother vessel. Now this was not a time for them to relax. They weren't rowing at a leisurely pace and talking about the cool things they just did, talking about their girlfriends. I don't know what you guys talk about. I'm a girl. They had to have a sense of urgency. A lot of whaling was done in the tropics, and during this whole process they had put blood in the water, which meant they had sharks coming up and literally taking a bite out of their profit. And they also had a job to do, and they didn't want the blubber to spoil in any way before they got back to the mother vessel. Now, once back to that mother vessel, the same crew that rowed this sailboat also had to sail the mothership. They were the same crew, and they were also the same crew that had to do that process of rendering that blubber down to the oil. So again, they're not climbing back on board, high-fiving their friends, and having a coffee and a donut. No, they're immediately beginning that process of stripping the blubber off of the whale. If you're interested in that process, it is much better explained on board the mother vessel, the Charles W. Morgan, the last surviving whale ship in the world, where you can see step by step where each part of that process would have taken place. And if you're interested in what it would have looked like, we actually have excellent photos of it on the other side of the whale ship. We have the whaleboat shed, which has photos of them stripping that blubber off of the whale. If, however, you are captivated by what we are doing here, which we definitely hope you are, you can join us for the next 2 parts of this 3-part demonstration. This is part 1. Part 2 is we're going to take this boat out and put her through her paces and show you just how maneuverable whaleboats were. If you're interested in that, you can follow our shantyman David, who's over there, and I'll lead you over to watch us do that. And then we hope you all enjoy us for the 3rd part of this demonstration, which is back on board the Charles W. Morgan. We need to raise this boat back up onto the ship. And so if you would like to get your hands on a line and pull something, or you simply want to help us rock the ship back and forth, we'd love to have you there. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day here at the museum.